I was hoping we could just start the interview with, you telling viewers a little bit about yourself, your experience, your occupation, that sort of thing.
Sure. I'm Ryan Melton. I'm just turned 40 years old, father of two boys, married to my wonderful wife, Laura, and I currently work at an insurance company. I'm a people leader there. I've been a people leader for about 8 years. Before Nationwide, I earned my bachelor's in history and political science from Iowa State University and my master's in U.S. history from the University of Kansas. And currently in the middle of my second run for Iowa, 4th Congressional District in the U.S. House.
So, what made you decide to run against Representative Feenstra? I know you said this is your second time running, so if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the first time I ran because no one else was going to. Mid 2021, when JD Scholten announced he was not going to run for a third time, the first reaction my wife and I had was more of an interest of who was going to run again, never thinking it'd be one of us. But by the time we got to January of 2022, we were just a couple months out from the filing deadline where you have to get your signatures in. It was really clear that not hearing a name emerge after talking to folks within the party, that we really just were going to give up. We couldn't find anyone to do it. And I just thought that was unacceptable. And so I knew that I'd make a better option, despite the fact that, I had no money, connections, pedigree, or name recognition, than a blank spot on the ballot. And I think we more than proved that to be true.
And so, if you are elected, what's going to be your number one priority?
Well, I'd say the number one priority is there is a very high baseline amount of stress that most Americans have to live with that we can do something about, and primarily that stress is financial. We have 60% of Americans that live paycheck to paycheck, and that number has been roughly the same for decades now. There are a lot of reasons for that. The fact that we've seen massive spikes in productivity as a labor force, and yet pay has not remained constant with that spike of productivity. So, definitely the fact that we have a federal minimum wage that hasn't moved in a long time. The fact that Iowa has a per capita household income that is lower, much lower than most of its neighboring Midwestern states. The fact that there's been this decades-long attack on workers' rights, on collective bargaining. And the fact that we live in a state where most of our representatives, either in Des Moines or DC, do not believe in investing in our communities. Especially in our 4th Congressional District, we're lagging behind significantly. And we have a congressman in Randy Feenstra who for 4 years in a row has asked for $0.00 of community project earmark money. And trust me, we need it. The other three U.S. House Republicans just this year alone asked for a collective $115 million in community improvement earmark money for their communities. So a lot of things that are driving the financial stress that most Americans are feeling, that has really not just been a one administration issue. This is something that's settled in for a long time now. So I really think we need some fundamental changes to lift a lot of that stress off of the shoulders of Americans.
And so, one of the things that you had just mentioned was the minimum wage. I was just curious, what your perfect idea of what minimum wage should look like. And obviously, it's something at the federal level too that there's a lot of mixed opinions on. So, is it something that you think, could gain bipartisan support? And if so, what does that look like?
Well, to me, I think it's absolutely immoral that someone can work a full-time job and be in poverty. I think that seems like a pretty basic worldview. But unfortunately, you have a lot of people in this country that work full-time and yet still have to rely on government benefits because their employer is not fulfilling their end of the obligation. So as far as what a minimum wage would look like, obviously all this would be complicated. You'd have to sit down with various experts in various fields to thread the needle. but it's a job worth undertaking. But that would be the baseline goal for me. Is a if you work full time, you shouldn't be in poverty. Now, as far as bipartisan support, well, I can tell you, I mean, in our fourth congressional district, which obviously is one of the more conservative congressional districts in the country, there are a lot of people in poverty here. And, I know that there are Republicans in the halls of Congress, there are Republicans in the state legislature that care about their constituents, and know that there are plenty of people that work very hard but still have to be in government assistance and who are still struggling with poverty and all of the stressors that come along with that. The fact that, poverty kills. Poverty kills in so many different ways. And so to me, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you believe in fair play. You believe that if you work hard, you should be paid commensurate with the value you bring. So to me, it seems like something that should eventually get bipartisan support. I think it's a matter, though, you have to create it in partnership with various entities. You have to be mindful of, in a small town and a mom and pop business, are they going to be able to do that as easily? Do you have to help smaller businesses with some kind of subsidy? Do you have to help? So there are certainly areas of complication that may impact rural Iowa more that you'll have to find other solutions for. But just because it's complex doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Because the fact of the matter is it's worth doing.
The other thing that you had mentioned were the earmarks, and with Representative Feenstra not, asking for money to go back into the fourth district. I was curious, if you are elected, what does that look like for you? What do you hope to invest in?
Well, I've thought a lot about this. The fact that there's this, so every member of the U.S. House can ask for funding for 15 projects annually. Um, and that got me to thinking the fact that Feenstra has literally asked for nothing for 4 years in a row when we have very pressing needs here. Um, I've thought quite a bit about something like maybe putting together town halls or some kind of mechanism through which people can tell me specifically what they would like to have funded. So it's supposed to be a community improvement earmark. So I'd want to get the community involved. Now, as far as the kinds of things we can do, Iowa has more bridges in need of repair than any other state in the country. Just a couple months ago, we just had a random bridge in Plymouth County in northwest Iowa collapse. Our bridges should not just be randomly collapsing. And the fact that we have this community improvement money on the table that we're not using, even though we're paying federal tax dollars to fund that, is illogical to me. So I think, the most pressing needs that cause the most risk of human harm, if not addressed, that also could help create jobs. I think that those would be really good parameters to focus on. So whether it be bridge improvement projects, infrastructure improvement projects in general. Also, if you talk to the business community, one of the reasons they don't plant new operations in our district nearly as often as we'd like to is because they feel like most of our communities don't have the sufficient amount of housing stock, childcare affordability and accessibility that a robust labor force would need. And so they fear like they can't get the workers they would need to that plant and keep them there. So we need to invest in those basic things in order to jumpstart our economic growth that I think is out there for us to gain.
And kind of taking a look again at, you talking about the poverty in the fourth district and people struggling. One of the things that Republicans often say is that's due to inflation, and then there's other things that need to be taken care of, maybe besides the minimum wage. How would you address inflation, and do you think that's a cause of, some people struggling?
Absolutely. So when you look at inflation, so if a business is selling you a product and they raise their price, the question is whether that price has been raised because of an increase in input cost. If so, companies would not be seeing record-breaking profits, but they are. And so, while certainly inflation began debated, it's been debated among economists, but you could say COVID was obviously a big driver of that because of, unfortunately, that exposed how weak our supply chains are. We don't have a lot of competition. We don't have a lot of domestic production. And so we had to rely a lot on international supply chains that were also impacted. So I think that taught us some really hard lessons about the fact that we need to fight monopoly power more effectively. We need to promote more corporate competition so we have more resilient supply chains, things of that nature. We need more domestic production. Um, but beyond that, yeah, I mean, there's been what we call greedflation. There was a legitimate bump in inflation because of COVID, although that bump was not as severe here as many other parts of the world, I should add. But it's been prolonged by this greedflation, by this price gouging. Um, and I think, what something similar to what a very conservative UK Parliament did. Um, they imposed a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in situations where they were price gouging during times of inflation. And I've long thought we should do something like that here. I think this idea, speaking back to raising the minimum wage, that, oh, we cannot raise the minimum wage because that'll then just mean that corporate America will raise their prices because they know there is more money to grab. I don't think we should be held prisoner to the whims of CEOs. And not all CEOs are bad. I'm not anti corporate, but this idea that you can't lift people out of poverty because we're beholden to the oligarchy in this country, um, I think that's unacceptable, and so I think that it is reasonable to say, hey, if you work full time, you shouldn't be in poverty. If we raise wages for people, that shouldn't inherently mean that the heads of corporate America can just raise the prices in response without some kind of action to defend the people. So I wouldn't be afraid to pursue things like windfall taxes to prevent price gouging, greedflation during times of inflation.
And another top issue for voters right now is the southern border. What are your thoughts on addressing that, and what do you see as being the problems?
Well, I think one big problem is there's a real lack of federal and state coordination. So what I've long been arguing for, the creation of a robust immigrant labor program that aligns migrant labor with labor shortage need across the country. And right now, you don't really have a lot of that, and so you have migrant flows to towns that where there hasn't been nearly as much thought about whether they have the housing stock and other amenities to absorb that flow of migration. So I would argue you need to have a formal program in place. Now, Northwest Iowa, I think, is a really good example. There are so many towns in our district that were dying because we've seen this decades long hollowing out and this massive population decline over so many of our communities. The vast majority of our 36 counties, when you move, outside of Ames, Council Bluffs, and Sioux City, have seen sustained decade after decade population loss, and you've seen immigrants come in and rejuvenate a lot of these towns. Marshalltown, Carroll, Denison, Storm Lake, Hayward, and I could go on and on. It is clear that in Iowa we have a real problem with a lack of sufficient labor. And so we've seen the response to that from the state legislature, I believe 2 sessions ago now, which is where they rolled back decades of child labor law to find other ways to fill that labor shortage gap. But I think, well, not only is it unconstitutional, but I think it's unjustified in the fact that it puts so many of our young folks in very risky situations. So I would instead, under this ideal program, set up a situation where if there is an increase in migrant flow, you can have this. So Governor Abbott in Texas can say, hey, we need some help alleviating the pressure here, the flow here. Well, up here in Northwest Iowa, as long as we have the housing stock we need, the other amenities we need to absorb folks so that communities aren't overwhelmed, we would be happy to take some of those because we need work to be done. And So that's my basic vision of what I think is missing right now. But without a question, the immigration system is broken, and there's much to do to make it more effective, to make it work for everyone.
And in regards to, illegal immigration and things like that, well, is there anything that you would like to see down at the southern border? I know there's been talks about, additional border patrol, making asylum easier to get, things like that.
Well, I mean, all of those certainly make sense, are very logical things to do. I mean, obviously, we have a really big backlog in legal immigration applications. Addressing that would certainly go a long way in making more and more people feel like, oh, I can apply through the legal process, and that would help reduce undocumented migration. We also have a big backlog in adjudication of asylum seekers' asks. So we need to hire more asylum judges. Um, I think the fentanyl issue has become a big deal, understandably so. There's been a very damaging impact with the amount of fentanyl that's in our country. So we need a lot more tech at the border, at ports of entry to identify drugs coming over. I would say that there's been a lot of misinformation about that. Randy Feenstra, my opponent, often tries to say that he tries to conflate immigration through non ports of entry with fentanyl. You talk to the experts on the southern border, and the vast majority of fentanyl comes through legal ports of entry brought over by U.S. citizens. So there's a lot of misinfo and a lot of fear mongering around that. Another piece here that's really important to speak to as well is, while certainly we need to do what we can on border security and on better managing that entire space in a wide variety of different ways, I'm also not going to peddle misinformation about the supposed threat of immigrants coming to our country. Donald Trump says over and over again that immigrants are the worst of the worst and they cause all this crime and all this harm. Every data point we have shows that both documented and undocumented immigrants in this country commit crime at much lower rates than native born citizens. If you talk to folks up here in Northwest Iowa, as to let's go to a farmer that has a larger operation, for example, that hires immigrant labor, right? The consensus from what I've seen out there is folks are really appreciative of the migrant labor that they have. They think that these folks are great people, hardworking folks who just want to build better lives for their families. And so I think you find a lot of Republicans up here that do not agree with Donald Trump's impression he's trying to create, that there's a swarm or a threat or an invasion. So that's simply not true. And I'm not going to feed into that kind of stuff.
And abortion is another big issue. Democrats are heavily running on it this November. So I was curious what your thoughts are on the issue, and what you would like to see happen in Congress.
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. I mean, again, I'm in a rather conservative congressional district, so I've spoken with a lot of folks that would consider themselves to be pro-life, both Democrat and Republican. Uh, but that means different things to different people. I've spoken to a number of folks that consider themselves to be pro-life who are rather shocked and alarmed by Randy Feenstra's push for a national abortion ban. They're rather shocked and alarmed by the new 6-week abortion ban in place in Iowa. They've read the language of the bill. They see that it puts the health of the mother at risk, that those exceptions for medical are not nearly as easy and as reasonable to get as one would hope. And they see that with the language of the bill, that a lot of healthcare professionals are put in impossible situations when they're trying to provide care for people, but they feel like their hands are tied. In Iowa, we are last in the country in OBGYN availability rate. And we have a lot of counties in my congressional district where we don't even have a single OBGYN. And that was before the downfall of Roe. So that's only going to be amplified. We've seen a lot of folks write about how med school students are not very willing to come to red states with abortion bans because they don't want to have to deal with all that legal uncertainty. So I definitely am a pro-choice candidate. I believe that there are, it's reasonable to say, hey, we should find ways to reduce abortion, but not through abortion bans, because abortion bans don't reduce abortion, notably. What they do is they just create a lot more back alley ones, a lot more dangerous ones, and create a lot of other terrible consequences, foreseen and unforeseen. How you reduce abortion is you create a true social safety net where young folks, if they find that they're pregnant, they feel like they have the supports they need, to carry through. And that there's a lot of ways that we can improve our safety net in that context, whether it be sufficient and affordable housing, childcare, healthcare, good paying jobs. And also, we need to do a better job in creating affordable and accessible birth control as well. Um, yes, so I'm definitely pro-choice. I'm certainly not in favor of legislative abortion bans. They don't work. They just create a lot more consequences of note. I think in Texas, there was a recent story that came out that since their abortion ban, they've seen a massive spike in pregnancy complication leading to maternal mortality. Um, Unfortunately, it looks like we're going to start to hear some of those cases in Iowa too, under the status quo now.
And I wanted to talk also about carbon pipelines. It's a big issue that you've been running on. Can you tell me why or what you would like to see done at the federal level and why you think it's a federal issue?
Well, it's certainly a federal issue. There's a 45Q federal tax credit. That is literally the reason that Summit, that Bruce Rest said are wanting to plant these pipelines. At the public hearings in front of the Iowa Utilities Board, now known as the IUC, but it's the same group, in Fort Dodge in the fall, the Summit representatives were very clear. They were not doing this out of climate change mitigation concerns. They were doing this for that federal tax credit. So it is absolutely a federal issue. So when Randy Feenstra, who used to be very public facing in his support for them and still does support them, but just doesn't talk about them as much anymore because he knows that he's out of step with most Iowans. One of the excuses he'll make is that it's just a state issue, which is absolutely false. That federal tax credit, if that wasn't there, there'd be no pipeline threat here. Okay, so that actually leads to what I would do if I were elected. The whether you agree or disagree with human caused climate change, I certainly think human caused climate change is a concern. Um, but whether you agree or disagree, I think everyone can agree that if you have legislation that gives you a federal tax credit for climate change mitigation strategies that allows for eminent domain abuse, that pushes false solutions, because these carbon capture pipelines, we have plenty of data that shows they will dramatically underdeliver on carbon sequestration. And in that same federal tax credit for climate change mitigation, you still get a lot of money if you use the captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery. It's illogical. It makes no sense. It's a scam. And that is a well intentioned federal tax credit that became corrupted because we have so much corporate money in politics. And so I would go to Washington, and similar to what a Ro Khanna is doing, the congressman from California, I would help him. I would partner with him to attack that grift, that theft that's unfortunately baked into that climate change mitigation tax credit. Let's fix that tax credit. Let's get it back to being what it was intended for initially, so that we don't see grift and false solutions like these carbon capture pipelines threatening people's lands and public health in our state.
We could just start with you talking about how you would address the eminent domain issue.
Yeah, yeah. So, I would also be concerned about the eminent domain issue if elected as well. Um, there is federal plug-in here. The Kelo decision, the Supreme Court decision, that unfortunately dramatically expanded the ability of governments to use eminent domain in situations where I don't think it's justified, has been a big concern, not just among myself and my Democratic friends, but also among my Republican friends in the Congressional District as well. And so I would do what I could at a federal level to rein in the eminent domain abuse that we're seeing here. I mean, the fact that, the Iowa Utilities Board granted this eminent domain when they were swarmed at their public hearings with people protesting and speaking out against it. Um, Again, they're just out of step. But a lot of this comes down to corporate money in politics. Bruce Rostetter, the godfather of these Summit Carbon Solutions pipelines, back in 22 gave a Governor Reynolds, who handpicks those eminent domain board approvers. He gave her, I think, something like $78,000 in 2022 in donations. He's given my opponent, Randy Feenstra, tens of thousands of dollars in donations. And so that creates a situation where 80% of Iowans are opposed to the use of eminent domain for these pipelines, and yet their elected officials and representatives can't defend them because they've taken so much money from the folks that would profit from these pipelines. So we've so much of our political process and so much of our governance is just backwards, and leads to these situations where we elect people to defend us and to represent us, and then they get all the corporate money and they forget who they're obligated to.
And I did have just a quick follow up to that. Obviously, this whole issue is going through the courts, not just here in Iowa, but in multiple states. I was curious if the courts rule in favor of Iowa landowners, is it something that you would still want to address at the federal level?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, since the Kelo decision a number of years ago, this has always been something that people are worried about. And again, the fact that you have an Iowa Utilities Board, now an IUC, that gave this sweeping eminent domain power to a private corporation to plant pipelines that not only aren't going to help the public good, but a lot of people argue are going to make the status quo worse as far as water availability, as far as public health. They really opened a Pandora's box here. I think every landowner in the state now has justifiable reason to be concerned that when the next project comes along, the bias is going to be towards the corporation and not towards the landowner. So this is something we have to address, despite or regardless of whether courts shoot down the efforts of Summit to lay these carbon capture pipelines.
One thing I wanted to talk about was, you're running for a seat in the 4th district, very big on agriculture. Where do you stand on, the farm bill, and how important would it be for you to get something new passed instead of just continuing to pass these resolutions to fund it?
Well, it's certainly a big deal, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in that farm bill if we write it the right way and get the right stakeholders at the table. I think unfortunately far too often the farm bill has been full of giveaways to the wealthiest, most powerful folks in ag. But regardless of the context, I'm always going to be concerned about consolidation of power, consolidation of land ownership. Ultimately, in rural Iowa, our wealth is in our land. And we're seeing this continuing consolidation of power and land ownership in the hands of the few. I want to reverse that trend. It's hard to do when you have such high barriers to entry for first-time farmers. The cost of land, machinery, inputs are prohibitive for most. And so I think with the Farm Bill, I would certainly encourage developing new pathways for small and mid-scale first-time farmers to get into the game. Also, we have a really big issue with water quality in the state. It's an issue that comes up all the time on the campaign trail, and we can use the Farm Bill to incentivize more robust best practices in that space as well. So that certainly would be a big priority for me. And you know what? If you talk to plenty of agronomists in the state, they're very concerned about the unsustainable topsoil erosion that we're seeing. And that in the next 50 or so years, plenty of agronomists have said we're not going to be able to do ag the way we do it now because we're not going to have the topsoil we need to do it. But you don't really have politicians, leaders talking about that concern. So absolutely, there's a number of things we can address. On top of that, one of the big reasons why the Farm Bill has been held up in Congress now is because there's been this attempt by folks like my opponent, Randy Feenstra, to cut food assistance benefits. And I'm certainly not in favor of that. And so that would be a big priority as well for me. And then finally, focusing on developing more local and regional food systems to eliminate waste in our food systems. There's some dispute over this number, but some experts say that we import up to 90% of the food we eat in this state, and that is mind blowing considering the ag centered economy we thrive in. And so that inherently builds in a lot of waste, a lot of inefficiency, and amplifies food insecurity. Yeah, so those are top of mind for me as far as the Farm Bill context is concerned.
One of the other agricultural issues that we've been seeing at the federal level is this concern over foreign ownership of, Iowa farmlands. And then also recently, Ashley Hinson, has talked about the foreign drones and things that are working on the farms. I was just curious if this was something, you're at all concerned about, if you've been hearing it from constituents, and if you had any thoughts on it.
My opponent, Randy Feenster, has talked quite a bit about Chinese ownership of farmland. I guess what I'd say in response to that is certainly I agree that we should own our own food systems. That anytime you have a foreign actor, regardless of who it is, owning important pieces or significant pieces of your food system, there is reason for worry that those who own it are not going to be nearly as concerned about stewardship of that land. I will say, however, that if you look at Randy Feenstra's contributions, he's taken an awful lot of money from companies that are backed by Chinese entities, the Chinese government. So, for example, he's taken a lot of money from Smithfield, a lot of money from Syngenta. So a lot of money in the ag space from companies that have Chinese government backing. And so I'd argue that while I understand his argument as far as land ownership, I think a lot of folks would say that the Chinese government doesn't need to own our farmland to own Iowa ag. Smithfield is now owned by a Chinese government-backed conglomerate. And so I would argue that my opponent needs to go a lot further and stop taking money from these companies that are backed by the Chinese government.
And then another issue, and I don't remember if we touched on this one, was affordable housing. Could you talk a little bit about where you kind of stand on that and what you would like to see done?
We need a lot more of it. In our congressional district, when you talk to members on city councils, county boards of supervisors, and you ask them how they're doing in their efforts to attract more business to rural Iowa, one of the things that will always come up is the lack of housing stock and how entrepreneurs, CEOs, when they look at rural Iowa and they see that we have an insufficient housing stock to absorb and house a worker base if they were to plant operations in rural Iowa, that's a big disincentive. Your workers need places to live. That's also, you tie that into the fact that we have a child care affordability and accessibility crisis in rural Iowa. That's also a big disincentivizer when it comes to trying to get companies to plant new operations in rural Iowa. Big time concern. Unfortunately, you have some situations where folks are of the not in my backyard mindset with affordable housing. I think that in the community space, you certainly need to be mindful about citing affordable housing so you can get as much buy-in as you can from the community. But I absolutely think it's a top priority, not just for just housing people, but for incentivizing business development.
And then another issue, especially for older Iowans, is Social Security. How would you address, the concerns of, Social Security not being, or the federal government not being able to, keep up with Social Security payments, in a few years?
Yeah, so a Randy Feenstra will never say something like this, but that is the obvious solution. The obvious solution is to raise the cap on taxable income or eliminate it completely to keep the Social Security fund replenished. So Randy Feenstra is on the Republican Study Committee, which is a group of Republican congressmen that release budgets occasionally, and a budget they recently released proposed raising the Social Security eligibility retirement age to 70. And Randy Feenstra has also been quoted in a Glenwood, Iowa newspaper as seeming to embrace that idea that we need to lift the eligibility age when it comes to retirement. I think that's a completely wrong-headed idea. During COVID, we saw a decline in life expectancy in our country. Our life expectancy is lagging behind our peer nations across the world, and we already have a higher retirement benefit eligibility age than our peer nations around the world. So the last thing we should be doing is raising that retirement age eligibility. Um, the obvious answer is lifting the cap on taxable income. It's upper 160,000 is the cap on taxable income to replenish the Social Security fund. So it's a pretty regressive tax. We need to lift that cap.
And another issue that we're seeing more here in Iowa, are school threats are increasing. School tips that the Governor's School Safety Bureau is receiving are increasing. Um, Oftentimes we hear from Iowans, we don't want to infringe on the Second Amendment right and things like that. But how do you address this issue, maybe more at the federal level?
Well, I think there are a number of things out there that most Americans agree on that our members of Congress have not delivered on. And a lot of that is because there's a disproportionate and excessive impact of corporate power on our politics and our governance. So that has led to our members of Congress not being where we, the American people, are. But you'll find near universal support for things like universal background checks, for making sure that the waiting period for firearms is extended if there's delays in getting the background check in, closing various loopholes. I'm a believer that red flag laws, as long as you do the best you can to strike a balance between Second Amendment rights and public safety, I'm a believer in red flag laws. And you hear of so many of these school shootings, and just about every situation is one in which there were clear warning signs. Um, but a lot of states don't have robust red flag laws at this point. Um, but a robust red flag law would have stopped a lot of the school violence that we've seen when it comes to school shootings. So there's a lot out there that we need to do that we have yet to do. And again, a lot of it is because of the disproportionate influence that folks like the NRA have upon our governor, upon our both our governance and our politics.
We're also seeing, the war that broke out over there in the Middle East, Israel, Hamas. Most recently, we did see Iran launching missiles at Israel. I was just curious what you feel the solution is.
Well, I don't. There's not an easy solution to it. I think as a baseline, we have to figure out in some way the center point of the crisis in the Middle East, which is the relationship between Israel and Palestine. That really is the root of the issue. And if we don't address that and get closer and make progress toward a two-state solution, you're going to continue to see these problems. Now, October 7th was horrible. What Hamas did was horrible. And obviously, we should do whatever is reasonable to end Hamas's leadership in Palestine. That's obvious. At the same time, I certainly am concerned and have been concerned about how Netanyahu has conducted the operations in Gaza and the West Bank. We have plenty of human rights organizations, plenty of monitors on the ground that have long expressed alarm at the seeming lack of consideration for minimizing civilian casualties. And we've seen tens and tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, often through the use of non-precision munitions dropped on heavily populated areas. And so the other thing that you've seen that is continuing to ramp up these crises across the Middle East is this continued expansion of the Israeli settlements into Palestinian neighborhoods. There's been a ramp up of violence in the settler expansion context. And the Israeli government has long turned a blind eye, or in some cases, allowed that to happen. And that is a flashpoint. And so there are a lot of things at the root that have not been mitigated that need to be mitigated if you're going to have any chance to have long lasting peace, not just for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. I think that you look at the sentiment of Israelis, polling, massive protests in Israel. And there are a lot of Israeli citizens that are also unhappy with how Netanyahu has conducted these operations in Palestine and feel that his actions have made it less likely that they will find long lasting peace as well. So, a lot of root issues that we need to get to more bravely and more robustly. Um, but there's no easy solution, obviously.
So if you were in Congress, addressing this issue, what would you be proposing, they do to help or do nothing?
Well, I definitely, and I've been very public facing about this on the campaign trail on my social media accounts. Um, I would have voted no as far as providing offensive military aid to Netanyahu as long as he continues to conduct these operations without sufficient care or concern for civilian casualties on the ground. I think that as long as we continue to provide that military aid for his offensive actions, it doesn't much matter what members of Congress or the administration say about how concerned they are, because words are one thing, actions are another. And so I've long advocated for removing that offensive military aid until a plan is presented and proven that would show an end game that is reasonable and a sufficient concern for minimizing civilian casualty. Up to this point, as far as we know, Netanyahu has not provided that and certainly hasn't shown that he has that as a top concern, considering all the obvious news and data we have coming from that region.
And then just kind of my last thing, there was an unusual move in the fourth district with Feenstra's Republican opponent in the primary endorsing you for the November election. I was just curious, what kind of message you feel like that sends to the Iowans of the fourth district.
Well, I think it sends the message that the Republican rank and file voters, not the leadership, but the rank and file voters, are really dissatisfied with what state Republican Party leadership has done. There's a lot of anger in a wide variety of areas among those Republican rank and file voters, from the fact that their party's leadership has sold them out to Bruce Rostetter and these carbon capture pipeline companies that are trying to use massive amounts of eminent domain to take their land away while laying pipelines that will pose a really notable public health risk to them, while being a big waste of taxpayer money, because these pipelines are not really all that effective in mitigating carbon emission. We have plenty of data around that. They're also really frustrated about the attacks on the public schools and the AEAs. The reddest of Republicans in small town Iowa know that if your public school collapses, your town is going to collapse soon after it. In many of these small towns, the public school is the number one employer, and it's the glue that's holding the town together. They're also really frustrated, and I know this because I've spoken to rooms full of Republicans throughout this cycle. They're also incredibly frustrated that we have a cancer crisis in this state, and yet their elected officials and candidates are not talking about the root causes of the cancer crisis and attempting to mitigate them. Kevin Virgil, who endorsed me from the Republican side, is the only Republican elected official or candidate in my district that I have been able to find that acknowledges the cancer crisis and that wants to do something about it. And I know that because he was sharing my social media posts about it during his primary against Feenstra. This selling out, this disregarding, this neglect by Iowa Republican Party leadership of their Republican rank and file voters, that led to Kevin Virgil's endorsement. Per his endorsement article he wrote on his X account, was reaffirmed by the fact that the week after the endorsement, you had so many leaders of the Iowa Republican Party circling the wagons to attack Virgil, but none of them addressed any of the concerns that he had that are very reasonable, legit concerns, considering the decline across quality of life indicators in rural Iowa.
And I did just have one more follow up. So obviously, the fourth district has gone has a history of going towards the Republicans in these election cycles. Is there anything that feels different to you this time around?
Well, I think the endorsement from Kevin Virgil it really encapsulates all of what is different that I've been feeling out here throughout the entire campaign, and we've been an active campaign since July 4th of last year. It is undeniable that there are a lot of massive problems in our state. The long litany of things that I went through, the fact that we're really struggling economically compared to our neighboring Midwestern states. We have one of the lowest rates of growth per by state in the country. We have a much lower per capita household income than most of our surrounding Midwestern states. Um, the Republican rank and file voters have long been expressing to me for well over a year now that there have been enough thresholds hit as far as failure from Republican Party leadership in this state that while they may not be flocking to change their affiliation to Democrat, they are ready to make a protest vote. They want to make a protest vote to send a message to Republican Party leadership that they are no longer going to be taken for granted. And they see in me someone they can trust, someone who calls it as they see it, someone who rejects corporate PAC money, someone who's willing to speak truth to power regardless of political affiliation. And so I think we're really building a cross-partisan movement this time. And I feel optimistic that at minimum, we're going to put a big dent in the status quo where a Democrat hasn't won a congressional election out here in 40 years.